Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Chris, and this is my midterm evaluation video. So before I begin, I just want to give an AI tool disclosure based on how I generated structure of the presentation for my midterm evaluation. So the tool that I used, Claude Anthropic, which accessed via its chat interface. So how did I use it? So I gave it a teaching script that I generated myself that I wanted it to help me refine the structure and the wording of my teaching script, which I drafted. And the tool also flagged and corrected a few technical inaccuracies in my draft, which I then verified as a result. And I also today, to ensure that we can understand the lessons I will teach today, I want to have visual aids generated. I had a course concept map, an original restaurant metaphor diagram to help us understand the concepts that we've discussed so far in the summer semester, two DOM tree diagrams, a progression graphic, a slide deck, and a set of full screen transitions and title cards. So for the first half of the semester, we've gone from a blank document or a file to a fully working full stack application, learning technologies and their tools, the concepts of how to make modern web applications possible. So during this session, the next half hour or so, my goal is to go through a midterm recap. So we've gone from blank document to a working full stack app. We built each layer that builds on the last, so the structure, the style, the behavior, the server plus the DB. We've also seen how it all connects, and I will also show you how it connects with the two branches, the building blocks and the architecture. Then I'll go through a concept tour from the front end, the HTTP server database, and the full request loop. And then I will also go into a deep dive of the separation of concerns, which is, three jobs, three files, and I'll show live on how that bug occurs and how it proves why it needs to be fixed. Then I will build a mini event board, switching to the code editor. And also, I will be putting it all together in order to understand the full stack structure, the style, the behavior, the transport, the logic, and the storage as we wrap it up in this session. So let me begin here. Here's the whole picture, right? We started with a blank document. It built up layer by layer, working into a full stack application. So now I'm going to show you how all of these things play together. So when I first entered the course, I thought web development meant, simple HTML, CSS, JavaScript, build a website, and then you're done. But then I realized that modern applications are more system-based, which are a collection of processes or programs in execution, and those systems are built in layers. So if I had to summarize the whole semester into one diagram, here's how I would put it. So here, the first branch is the building block. These are the three languages that run in our web browser. So we have HTML, we have CSS, and we have JavaScript. First, HTML is the structure, that's the skeleton. Then we have CSS, which is our style, which is the skin and the clothes, how the website will look. And JavaScript is strictly the behavior. It's the muscles and the nervous system that makes these things move and react. So in the structure branch for the HTML, we typically have a doc type HTML root element. Then we have our tag for head and the body content. Then we have our semantics, we have our block and inline elements, we have attributes, and we have classes. And then what does that do? The browser parses the HTML and then converts into a DOM tree or a document object model. Then we have our cascade and style sheet, which is our CSS. Then we have rules, we have selectors with those properties and their values. We can do select by element, ID, and relations. We also have the box model, which I'll show you in the console when we do a live program. We have content pattern, border, and margin. Then we do layouts with flexbox and grid. Then we also have precedence, which is what I will build on for the separation of relevance when it comes to the example I'll show you, where it's still when we have inline versus external and internal style sheets. So I will show you the precedence of how that works. And another framework that we were taught, which is Bootstrap framework, which was given to have pre-built components that we can use in our web applications. And we're also told to avoid exclamation point important. Then for JavaScript is pretty much the event handler. So we can declare variables with constant let, which are block elements, but we never use var. Then we have functions, and function definitions can be either function, then the function name, or we can pass a function into a variable here, and we can also pass it by an arrow function. Then we have ES6 modules, which allows us to do import statements for modules that we can use, or we can export default modules that we create for like routes, for example. Then we have asynchronous programming, which are promises. Then we have async and await, and we also have fetch. Then also JavaScript does DOM manipulation and event handling. So for the second branch, we have web architecture. This is how the building blocks get delivered over a network. Then that is where the client and the server architecture lives. So you have the server, you have the Node, Express, the database, and the Mongo. So the browser is what renders the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It sends HTTP requests, it updates the DOM with results with no reload. Then in the transport layer, according to the OSI model, we have methods that map to CRUD operations such as get, which receives data from the server. Then it has a post, which we can create data via an API. Then we have put, which updates data, and we have delete, which we can delete any resource on a server. So then now we have the URL, which the syntax is simply the protocol HTTP or HTTPS for secure. Then we have security purposes. Then we have our server, our port, which is our endpoint for communication. Then we have the path. And also you can have a query string at the end with a question mark to form when we want to get a specific resource. Then we have our Node plus Express server, which runs on Node.js. Then we create routes via the app.get path when we pass in the path and the handler, which is our callback. Then we have, if we want to service or pull our front end directory, then we can pass it into our express.static, our function, which serves those files. And then also we have to listen onto the endpoint for communication, which is our port. Then we think, okay, where does the data reside? Well, mentally, we would have to consider that since this is a non-relational database that we use, we typically store documents in a JSON-like doc, then collections, then they're forming collections, not SQL tables. And you can either download it locally via its image in Docker, or you can have Atlas via the cloud. And you can also run it in the command line or Compass, Driver, and MongoDB query language, which we've also have done. So when you consider this paradigm, the web development paradigm, this became my mental map. This top creates experience and the bottom half moves information, and together they create applications. So to make the bottom concrete, I use a running metaphor. And here is where I create this running metaphor. Web development is like a restaurant. Think of a restaurant. You're the browser placing an order. HTTP is the waiter carrying it back and forth to the kitchen. The server is the kitchen, and the database is the pantry where the data lives. Hold on to that picture. It comes back at the end. So now, when we consider the first structure, which is our DOM tree, is when you consider that HTML is the structure. So when a page opens, we first have the doc type, which is included here, which is the declaration is not technically a DOM node. Rather, it tells the browser, hey, render this page as an HTML5 version, so that everything that we make when we render a web page, it will automatically know in the browser what to do with it. So now our HTML tag, which is our root tag of the whole DOM tree. Then we have our headers. We have the head tag, which holds the metadata. We have the body tag, which is so we have two children for the root, which is the HTML, the head and the body. And each of those things now, the head will contain the meta, the title, the links. You can also, and then now for the body, you'll have H1 tags, buttons, on ordered lists, script, and also it will show even the class or the IDs associated with those things, which I'll create live. And so when we consider these things, now, once it's structured, CSS makes it look right. So CSS styles the page with the selectors, the box model, the flex box, and the grid and precedence, which I'll come back to. And Bootstrap gives us the pre-built components. So now, and JavaScript makes it move. So JavaScript adds the behavior. So we can declare variables like const, let, functions, and closures, and ES6 modules, and we have also data types like arrays, which like we have map. We can apply methods like map, filter, reduce, async/await, which fetches for data, and it also manipulates the DOM and handles events via the npm, ESLint, and prettier to keep the code clean. So now that's what happens in the browser. So now we have to question, well, how does it talk to the server? So now we have to consider the right branch for our understanding of what happens in the server. So now when we look at the branch here, we see, okay, we have Node Express and the server. So now we know that HTTP carries requests and its methods. So we have some CRUD operations that occur here. Then we have which map onto CRUD. So now we have two different architectures that we typically applied for project one and project two. The first project one, we had a client and server two-tier client server architecture. And for project two, we had a three-tier client server architecture, which we use a client, the server, plus the database, which creates a full stack application. So, and the server runs on Node with Express, and when a route maps a method and path to a handler, and MongoDB is our database, JSON-like documents and collections, then we can also see how the data will be stored via the non-relational database collection running in Docker or Atlas, which is queried through the MongoDB query language. So now let's put it all together into a single click. So now if you imagine where, let's say I want to go access a resource, and that resource will tell me how I can manipulate the DOM. So here, if we look here in the interactability with web applications, this is just a conversational example. So now when we consider that, I let's say I'm the client, I want to access view trials. So for my second project, I did an oncology trial information systems. So here, this simulates that same interaction. So first, I'll click the view trials. Then the browser will send a request, which is via the HTTP protocol, which is a GET, to the route, which is our endpoint API/trials, which will be serviced in the server express. Then server processes that request and asks the database for the data itself, which is stored in a collection here. Then the database will return that data via the trials collection. Then the server will serve back and send back that response via JSON data, which will be parsed. And then now on the client side, you can finally see the trials done and completed. So when you consider the separation of concerns, we have our structure, which is our index.html file. We have our styles, which is our styles.css file. And we also have behavior, which is typically stored in our main.js file. So you can cram all of those things into one file. It will produce the same result. So why split them? Well, so let's say for the header tag, h1 tag, I set style equal to color blue. And in here, in the styles, I set color to white. Then you might ask yourself, well, what will it render? Which precedence takes hold for this style versus this style? Well, when it comes to precedence, actually, this will take the highest precedence. So the color should actually switch to blue when we show it in the web browser. And it will supersede anything that I wrote here in the CSS file. So when I render this template, it should show upcoming events in blue. And if I take this out, then it should take us back to our default. Now, this is not a good standard for styling individual elements, because this is where the separation of relevance comes in. When we create individual packages of programs, we don't want to keep everything in one file. So if I wanted to, I could have did all of my logic here for manipulation of the DOM. I could have did it all there. But now what if something goes wrong in the script file and in the script body in the HTML file, and I want to trace for debugability? Well, that's not going to be good, because if I want to debug, I want it to be easier for me to pick up on those bugs when files are independent of one another, so that I can trace through every single file to make sure that I find out where it went wrong and what can I do about it. But if I have everything packaged and tightly coupled in the index.html file, it makes things messy. So typically we don't have, if we wanted to, we can have inline styling, but for precedence purposes, you want to make sure that you have a module or application where you separate your styles, your main JS, all of your script, everything that you do should not be in one file because it doesn't make a clean program. So now another depiction that we can look at here is the full picture. So we have our front end trio, which is like, a house analogy. We have our client server architecture, which is our analogy that I used here. Then we have our HTTP protocol here, which shows the request and response pathways, our communication channel. Then we'll have Express.js, which will show our routes and it directs it each request to the right handler. Then we have our MongoDB, which stores the data as documents. So you see all of these are packaged separately. So I will show you now in a live demo how you can go about doing these things. So here, I typically like to start with my package dependency. So I'll open a new terminal here. And the first thing I would like to do is to initialize our package JSON. So I'll type in npm init y. So now we have our package JSON here. So typically another thing that we would like to do is we would like to add type, which is our module, because we want to use ES6 modules here. Then typically the license that we use for the course is MIT. The author will be me. Then also another couple commands I would like to do is I would like to add in ESLint Prettier and the plugin so that we can do formatting when we do our JavaScript files. So save dev to ESLint Prettier. And then we would like to do, trying to remember from top. Yes, ESLint plugin Prettier. So now that should be a dependency down here. Should make sure this is correct. Great. So now the next thing I would like to do is I would like to initialize ESLint and it's going to be a JavaScript file. Check syntax and find problems, yes. This will be modules. I have none of these technologies or frameworks. Does the project use TypeScript? No. And will I be using Node? Yes. Now, would I like to be installed globally? Yes. NPM. And now it's installing exactly what I need. So now, great. Now I have the configuration file for ESLint and modules. So now another thing that we also have to do is we need to make sure that we have a way to run our server. So here is where I will have a field for our nodemon. So nodemon will be the server that we run so that it can constantly refresh the web page whenever we make changes to it. So here, this is where I will type in node, then node modules, access the node modules, which is located over here. Then we will have the nodemon folder. Then also we will access this binary file here. And then we will have nodemon.js, which is the file within it. And then let's say I will create a backend.js file, which I would like to run for our backend. So now let me make a file, backend.js. So as I continue, I realize I forgot to attach the save so that I can have the dependency load in the package JSON file. Great, here we go. So now as I do npm install save, we will need a one for Express. Not be doing any Mongo here. So now when I have these dependencies, now I have nodemon available if I want to run a server. And I also have the type module so that I can do import statements for modules. So now I'm going to go to my backend, and now let's construct the backend file for this. I typically like to start with the backend because it's the easiest so that when I start my server, then I can just simply test the routing. So here I would do an import to express from express. Then I would like to do an import to process from process so that when I do the creating of the variable for port, it will recognize from the module process. Then let's initialize the app here. Then let's initialize the port equals at, process dot env dot port or 3000. Then I would like to create a static folder. So here, this will be a temporary placeholder. So I will have a static folder that I will pull in, which would be called front end, so that I can access my index.html, my JS file, and anything else that I need from my front end directory. So that's what I'll have here. And then as for the rest, I'll add in a port so I can listen in. And then I will print simply that it is running on this port. So application running on port. And this should work now. Great. So now we have our basic backend.js file, and I will continue to add on to it once I make the front end directory. So now here, I will make the front end directory. Yeah, front end directory, all caps. Okay, so now here, I will make sure I add in an index.html file. And I will use the shortcut that we typically use when I do that, HTML:5, which will give me just a boilerplate basic HTML template that I can now edit. So now here, we're going to be building an event board. So the title will be called event board. And typically we would also add in our CDN here for Bootstrap, but I may or may not have time for that. But if I do, I will add that. Then I will simply add in a link to my external style sheet here. Should be style sheet. And where is that here's that reference? It will be placed in the styles, and then it'll be called style.css. Great. So now I will create a file, a directory for styles in our front end. And I will add a file called style.css. So now it will pull on this CSS file as the front end for here. So now, next, I would like to create in the body a header tag. And typically we usually create one H1 tag for good full stack development. So now I will call this upcoming events. Then I would like to add in a button with an ID equal to event list so that I can manipulate that later. And this one will be, oh, excuse me, actually, I would like to call this event ID. This will be ID equals load button. Then I will load my events here. And I also like to add a footer, which will house ampersand copy. This will be my copyright, Timothy Chris Jr., summer 2026. So now when that renders, I'll have a copyright sign here. Then I'll have my name and the summer. Then also let's add in a unordered list with an ID equal to event list, because I would like to manipulate that later in my main.js file. And speaking of my main.js file, let me add in a script here so that I can import that here as well when it's rendered. So I will have src is equal to js / main.js. So now that's my script so that I can make one here. So now I will make my JS directory. Then I will make my main.js file here, which is where I'll do all of my event handlers and manipulations in here for the DOM. So now this is my basic boilerplate. You notice how we have a link to style sheet and we also load the JS as a type module script. That is where separation of concerns will come in from that line. So now let's start to add in some nice styles to our style.css file. So here, let's say for the body, I would like to make a font, a specific font. Let's do system UI and sans serif. So now that'll be the font family for the body tag. Then let's say the margin will be 2rem. Then also let's do the ID customization. And this will be nested because we want the list item within the unordered list ID. Then we're going to have padding as part of the box model, 0.5 rem. Then let's also have a border bottom, which is 1 pixel thick, solid. And let's make that color blue because blue is my favorite color. Great. So now we have basic CSS boilerplate code that will be rendered in for the HTML file as it pulls in on the external style sheet up here. So now let's move on to our event handling in our main.js file. So here, this is where I want to grab the button from the DOM, attach an event handler listener function, and then on click, I will async / await that workflow to fetch data to my server, then build a list of items and append that to the DOM via the append child function. So here, this is where I will grab the button and use the document or the DOM API query selector, which will select my ID, load button. Another thing I like to do is check in my index.html file that I have the correct ID for that button, which will load events, which is correct. Then I would like to grab on the list, which will be document.query selector. And we know that that will also have events list. So I grab on that ID, which I like to check here, which is here, event list. So now we have grabbed the button for the DOM and we've attached an event, and now we will continue to attach for the event listener here. So let's make an asynchronous function which loads our events once you click the button. Then we'll have a response to that, which will be encompassed in a wait call, which will fetch from our route, which will be, let's say, API events. So now this will be our AJAX call or our asynchronous JavaScript call that requests to our server so that we can get to the endpoint for the API / events. Then let's have another one that gets the response back for our JSON once it's parsed, because we want to parse our JSON here. So now that'll be the call there. So now, next what I'm going to do is I would like to create a empty response, HTML equals this. Then let's iterate through our events here. So let's do, so I will actually call it events dot, then we'll use our for each that we were taught. We'll pass an event. Then we would do our function definition here. Then let's add in let's create a new element so that we can append that child. to the DOM, which would be a list item, which is our DOM manipulation here. Then next, we're going to add text content to that new created DOM object, which will now be equal to, then we have our notation here, then we'll have event.name, which I'll create, and then we'll also have event.date. Then now we need to append that child to the DOM. Let's make sure this is good. Then we have here. So now let me double check my arrow functions. Event.for each. So now let me fix my arrows so that I can recognize my rate. And then here. So now I've set up the main JS file so that now we can perform some DOM manipulation. So now let's go back to our routes in our backend. So now I can uncomment this out because now we can directly get to the static file here. So now let's say I want to run this application. So I will do npm start. Now this will be running on the local port. Actually, I realized I almost forgot one of the most important elements. We actually have to create the route for the API event so that it can actually render that in our backend. So let me go back here and share my screen. So now let's create a route that does a get crude operation, which will be our API events. Then we will have to have a request response here, arrow function, let me add in that. And then now we'll have a response that will parse it into JSON, and we want that to be an array. And then now let's have those fields that we made. So we'll have a name, let's call it hackathon. And also let's have a date field, which will be 2026, 07, 01. Gotta love the single digits. Then we'll also have another one that does the name, which would be Tech Talk. And let's have a date, which will be 2026, 07, 05. Great. So now here, we will make sure that we have, I'm sorry, that's my family excited. My sister just got her job offer, so I'm very happy. And now that's her in the background screaming. Excuse me. So now, as we go here, now when I apply those changes, let's make sure that we can see those changes so that now when it renders the template, it should be able to show everything that I've designed up to this point. Render. Great. So now it rendered from the JSON everything that we wanted from our routes. And now that shows the full walkthrough of how we run NodeMon, how it refreshes the web browser upon any changes to your file in the project file, client-side rendering using express routing. And that is what sums up what I did for the live demo here. Understanding how when you want to see the individual pieces in client and server side handling, you can envision it based on every individual component, how they communicate with each other, how the client will receive data back after it makes a request, and how even the server has to go to the database, receive information, and then serve it back to the server, and then the server can finally serve it back to the client. That is the whole flow of how you understand the 3-tier model, or even the 2-tier if you just take out the MongoDB database. So there's a lot more ahead in the second half of the semester, and I'm looking forward to building on these foundations. Thanks to Professor Guerra for laying it out so clearly. Thank you for watching. My name is Timothy Chris, and this has been my midterm evaluation video. I hope you enjoyed.